Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I am Susan Byer. I'm the Executive Director of the Allen County Public Library and also a board member of the Friends of the Lincoln Collection. And I would like to welcome you to the 2023 McMurtry Lecture featuring Dr. Edna Greene Medford. Dr. Medford spoke at the Allen County Public Library in 2015, and we are so honored to welcome her back to Fort Wayne. Whether this is your first visit to our library or you are a longtime patron, we hope to engage you with all that ACPL has to offer. Family History Month is observed nationally each October, and our ACPL Genealogy Center is celebrating with 31 days of programming geared towards seasoned and rookie researchers looking to make new discoveries about their families and themselves. All programming is free and open to the public, and you can find a full listing of programs on our website. We also invite you to visit our Rowland Center for Lincoln Research on the first floor of our library to learn more about the life, times, and legacy of our 16th president. I was honored to be among the group leading a tour of the Rowland Center to Dr. Medford earlier this evening, and I believe it's safe to say she was very impressed with what she saw. Now, to officially introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening, I invite to the podium our board president for the Friends of the Lincoln Collection, Todd Stevenson.
The mic up a little bit. Thank you, Susan. On behalf of the Lincoln Financial Foundation Collection and the Friends of the Lincoln Collection of Indiana, I too welcome everyone in the audience and those participating via live stream to the 2023 McMurtry Lecture, The Pursuit of Freedom in a Free State, the Emancipation Proclamation's Significance to African Americans in Indiana. We at the Friends of the Lincoln Collection are a membership-supported organization, so thanks to our members for their support, and to those members that serve on our board. To that end, specifically to board member Bob Shantz, who provided the transportation for Dr. Medford from the Indianapolis airport and has arranged for her to speak to students tomorrow morning at Canterbury High School, before returning to Indianapolis for her lecture tomorrow at the Indiana State Museum. Special thanks, as always, to the Allen County Public Library for hosting this event today. It's only a small part of the partnership that we have with the library, along with the Indiana State Museum, for over 14 years, preserving and showcasing the life and legacy of our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln. Also, for many years, these lectures are also made possible through the generous financial support of the Lupke Family Foundation. Thank you all. Dr. Edna Greene Medford comes to us today as Professor of History Emerita at Howard University. Prior to her recent retirement as an active professor, she also proudly served the university as chair of the history department, as well as associate provost for faculty affairs. Her collegiate education started at the Hampton Institute, now Hampton University in Virginia, continued at the University of Illinois, Urbana, and then at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she received her PhD in United States history. As a scholar, administrator, she has authored, co-authored, or edited 3 books and over 24 articles and book chapters. Her life's work focuses on American slavery, the Lincoln presidency, the Civil War, emancipation, and Reconstruction. We are proud to be the source of Dr. Medford's most recent article, Lincoln, Douglas, and the Politics of Race, published just this last week in the latest edition of our Lincoln Lore publication. We do have a few extra copies in the lobby if you would like to pick up a copy of this important article and issue of Lincoln Lore. Her most recent book is Lincoln and Emancipation, in its second printing now, and edited by our very own Sarah Gabbard. Earlier, Dr. Medford co-authored with Harold Holzer and Frank Williams a landmark book titled The Emancipation Proclamation, 3 Views. Both Harold Holzer and Frank Williams are well known to the Friends of the Lincoln Collection. Both have appeared here as prior McMurtry lecturers, so how appropriate, and I might add, how overdue it is now to have Dr. Medford here to complete the Emancipation Proclamation trifecta. She has also served on several national boards, including the Executive Council of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the Executive Committee of the Lincoln Forum, and the Abraham Lincoln Institute. Among the many honors recognizing the work of Dr. Medford, I suspect as a University of Illinois alumni and Lincoln historian, you might cherish most one from the state of Illinois, which I believe is their highest honor, the 2009 Special Bicentennial Order of Lincoln. She is also a frequent guest speaker at conferences and seminars. In April, she was in state and spoke before an audience at Purdue University in connection with Brian Lamb's C-SPAN Center for Scholarship and Engagement to talk about African American history, U.S. presidents, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Dr. Medford, welcome back to Indiana. I hope your remarks today might include a hint or two about a current book project that I understand you are working on. It profiles a brave Hoosier that back in the days before the Civil War. Also, when you were here speaking at the library in 2015, I believe you made the comment about how much you would like to live in our state. And now, in 2023, as a recent retiree, and given all the dysfunction in Washington, D.C., how can we help you make that happen? With that, offer outstanding, please join me in welcoming Dr. Medford, our 2023 McMurtry Lecturer.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you all for being here. The last time I was here, I guess it must have been about 8 years ago, the Tin Caps were playing, and it was a lovely evening, and a lot of people decided to ditch me and go to hear them. So I am grateful to them for not playing this evening. And Todd, in terms of moving here, I would have to get my husband to finally retire. He has told me that he's never going to retire. He has retired twice already and always gone back to a new job. So it looks like I'm stuck on the East Coast for a while. I'd like to also thank Bob Shantz for picking me up at the Indianapolis airport and getting me here. Thank you, Bob. Where are you? There. Okay, thank you so much. And to Sarah Gabbard for a long-time friendship. I really do appreciate you. And I'd like to thank the Allen County Public Library and the Friends of the Lincoln Collection. I always enjoy being in the state, whether it's in Indianapolis or Fort Wayne or wherever. It's a great place, and I hope to be back soon. I'm going to talk a bit this evening about the person that Todd mentioned, William Trail, who was a Hoosier, not by birth, but by choice. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about who he was and why the proclamation was so important to he and his family. In August 1814, an enslaved resident of Lawrence County, South Carolina, made the fateful decision to free himself from 30 years of bondage. Born in the era of the American Revolution, he and other enslaved Africans received little consideration from men who fought to secure their own freedom from British tyranny while continuing to hold human beings as property. So in the final months of the War of 1812, William Trail, he had acquired this last name from his original enslaver, who we think possibly was his father. He traveled for more than 400 miles to southeastern Indiana, free territory, where he eventually settled in a little hamlet that became known as Trail's Grove. There, he and his wife Sarah raised 7 sons who, along with their father, were committed to freedom and equal treatment for all Americans. And I should say father and mother, because although we don't know very much about Sarah, she certainly was responsible for the growth and development of these 7 young men as well. Nearly a half century after Trail's daring escape north, Abraham Lincoln, during yet another war, made an equally bold move that declared freedom for Black men and women held in bondage in the Confederate States. While the proclamation only addressed the legal status of those enslaved African Americans living in the areas in rebellion, it nevertheless impacted the Black residents of Indiana, who occupied a position that fell short of what Trail and others had envisioned when they came to the state. African Americans lived under disabilities that kept them subordinate to their white neighbors and left them at the whim of any unscrupulous person who was willing to kidnap a free Black man or woman for profit or return a runaway to bondage. The eradication of slavery in the Confederate South moved Black Hoosiers closer to their goal to be treated as American citizens. In addition, it made it possible for both enslaved and free men to aid Union victory and to serve as an army of liberation for those still in bondage. African Americans, like the Trails, recognized that only if slavery could be ended would free Blacks receive the rights of citizenship shared by other Americans. The proclamation was a major step in securing that goal. African Americans who came to Indiana in the decade before the Civil War were of 2 types: freedom seekers, who were often fleeing many years of bondage, and free Blacks who were not allowed to benefit from the principles espoused at the nation's founding. Throughout the country, yes, in the South, but in the North as well, but with a few exceptions, they could not testify in court, serve on juries, hold public office, or educate themselves or their children. They were restricted in their choice of employment and forced to purchase licenses for the privilege of engaging in skilled labor. In some jurisdictions, they were required to register with local authorities, carry freedom papers, and post a bond as insurance against bad behavior or poverty. Their labor could be sold if they were unable to pay taxes, or fines resulting from violations of the law. The developing environment of central and southeastern Indiana, with its opportunities for land acquisition, held promise for those seeking escape from these limitations. Ready allies in the form of a significant Quaker presence strengthened their belief that they could gain independence and a fair deal in this free state. What they found upon arrival were policies of long standing that regulated the relationship between Blacks and whites since 1800, when Indiana was carved out of the old Northwest Territory. William Trail, arrived 2 years before statehood, when the area was still governed by territorial laws that prohibited slavery. Nevertheless, white residents found ways to maintain a system of unfree labor. In 1805, the legislature authorized the transfer of enslaved property into a system of indenture. Any African American who was above 15 and by law owed labor could enter the territory if his owner took him before the court within 30 days, and if the owner registered him and recorded the length of his indenture. The number of years purportedly would have to be agreed upon between owner and indentured servant. These indenture contracts sometimes stipulated what amounted to lifetime periods of service. So they could be 40, 50, 60, even 99 years. So that's slavery by any other name. If the person refused, the owner was required to remove him or her from the territory within 60 days to a place where he could be legally held in bondage. Anyone being brought in under the age of 15 could be compelled to labor until 35 if male, and 32 if female. Children born to parents who were indentured servants were required to serve a period of 30 years if boys and 28 years if girls. It's my understanding that the law was repealed a few years later, but you get a sense of how dire the circumstances are for Black people who found themselves in Indiana during this period. The territorial legislature also passed laws that denied Black residents civil rights and passed legislation that placed African Americans in a category separate from other Hoosiers. In 1803, a law was enacted which stipulated that, quote, no Negro, mulatto, or Indian could testify in court in cases involving whites. To ensure that persons of African descent could not declare themselves as white, the law also defined the term mulatto, indicating that anyone who was, quote, 1/4 part or more of Negro blood, or who had a grandfather or grandmother who was Black, would be deemed as such. So it's not just laws against people, of Africans, but laws against anyone who carried Black blood. As Trail soon learned, fleeing laborers were disadvantaged by national law as well. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 allowed enslavers to pursue their human property into other states and territories. The act set a penalty of $500 for anyone who aided or harbored a runaway. That's a lot of money during that period. Just weeks after Trail landed in Indiana, his most recent enslaver, a man named Blakely, came looking for him. And I should point out that Trail was held to labor. I don't like to use the word owner. Sometimes it's the only thing I can think of, but these are people who are being held to labor. They're not really property. They may be looked at as property. They may be judged as property, but these are human beings who are being held to labor. In any case, Trail managed to avoid being captured while proclaiming that he would never again consent to being enslaved. Two men who had befriended him and assisted in hiding him devised a plan that would help Trail acquire his freedom. And we need to remember that there's a strong Quaker presence in that area. The Quakers were definitely committed to helping enslaved people find a way around the efforts to re-enslave them. And so these two men came to his aid, as did many of his neighbors over the course of the next several years. Acting as his agents, the two men presented Blakely with a proposal to emancipate the enslaved man in consideration of $300. Again, a lot of money. An installment agreement was drawn up in which Trail promised to pay the slaveholder $5 immediately, with another $20 paid in 2 weeks. Additionally, $100 was to be paid to the slaveholder's agent on December 25th, 1815, and $175 on the same date a year later. Now, I don't know how someone who's a laborer gets this much money this quickly, but he did. I suspect that there were people who were willing to help him financially. He was very important to his community. He was a hard worker. He helped people clear the land. That was one of the most important things that he did for his community, was to help fell trees. And he also was a carpenter. And so there were people who valued his assistance, and some of them perhaps came to his aid. The document filed with the Franklin County Court on December 8, 1814, declared that the slaveholder's agent was authorized to release, liberate, exonerate, and discharge Trail forever. And from this day, the said will is hereby deemed and declared to be free to all intent and purposes. The interesting thing is, this is freedom on the installment plan, okay? I would not have believed that this was possible if I had not seen the document, but it is there. It's just amazing what he was able to accomplish, at least for the moment, because it gets more interesting as we go. Despite this pronouncement of freedom, Trail's legal status would be challenged twice more. Just as he was beginning to settle into life unencumbered by debt or obligation, Blakely challenged his freedom with the charge that Trail had not made the payments as promised. It is unclear whether his agents failed to turn the money over to Blakely's agent, or that the agent, Blakely's agent, did not deliver the payments to his employer as required. It is possible that Blakely saw the opportunity to have both the payments and the man who was once his property. In any case, the slaveholder sought the assistance of the courts to resolve the matter. A few months earlier, the district court had heard a case that seemed to have direct bearing on Trail's legal status. In the 1819 case Polly versus LaSalle, this is Polly Strong, an enslaved woman, the Circuit Court of Knox County found in favor of Hyacinth LaSalle, who claimed he was the legal owner of an enslaved woman whose mother had been purchased before parts of what became Indiana was made a part of the Northwest Territory. LaSalle's attorney had argued that while prohibiting slavery and involuntary servitude, the Northwest Ordinance had made provisions for the continuing unfree labor of those who were held before the area came under the ordinance's jurisdiction. Polly's attorneys appealed her case to the Indiana Supreme Court a year later. The court ruled that the framers of the Constitution in 1816, the Constitution that was established when Indiana became a state, had intended, as they said, a total and entire prohibition of slavery, thus effectively ending bondage and involuntary servitude in the state. Despite this ruling, however, Trail's status remained unsettled. In 1820, he was summoned to the Circuit Court in Franklin County, and after a short trial, the court found in favor of Blakely. But a year later, on appeal, the Indiana Supreme Court found in favor of the defendant, ruling that a slaveholder could indeed set his enslaved laborer free, but by the laws of Indiana, he could not sell him or recover payment from him in exchange for emancipation. So in other words, Trail had spent $300 and didn't need to do so. Nonetheless, Blakely continued the pursuit of Trail. In 1822, he struck a bargain with one John Cleveland, a Georgia slave trader. In exchange for his alleged ownership of Trail, Blakely received a horse from Cleveland. Shortly thereafter, Cleveland set out to recapture the man he now considered his property. Once he arrived in the area, he enlisted the aid of Samuel Hedge, a notorious ferry boat operator who was in the habit of transporting fugitives across the Ohio River and later betraying their whereabouts for a reward. With the assistance of the Fayette County Sheriff, Hedge attempted to apprehend Trail while he was helping a neighbor butcher hogs. Claiming that the now free man was wanted for a debt, Hedge and the sheriff tried to convince Trail to come along peacefully until the matter was resolved, on the promise that he would be allowed to stop by his home to change his clothes. And we need to remember William Trail, I guess we'd call, well, not quite a clothes hog, But he was someone who really cared about his appearance. And so when he was enslaved by Blakely, he was able to cut a deal with Blakely to allow him to work 1 day a week for himself, to allow him to hire himself out and earn enough money to buy his own clothing and to pay for his own food. So the idea that he wants to stop at home to change his clothes makes perfect sense because he thinks he's going before the court and he wants to look presentable. So Trail complied after they said that they would allow him to do that. But it soon became apparent that the men had no intention of honoring that promise or of delivering him to the courts. By this time, a third man, presumably Cleveland, had joined the kidnappers, and the trio proceeded to tie Trail to his horse and carry him towards slavery. His cries for assistance drew the attention of neighbors, one of whom agreed to accompany the group to Connersville and ensure Trail received a fair trial. When the man went back to his home to get his hat, the kidnappers tried to make off with their prey again. Trail resisted long enough to give his neighbor a chance to catch up, and the kidnappers acquiesced in taking their prisoner to town, as they had promised. What followed reflected the complexity of race relations in this newly formed free state. Trail spent 3 nights in jail while waiting for the regularly scheduled convening of the district court. In the meantime, realizing the recovery of the formerly enslaved man might not be as easy as he had initially anticipated, Cleveland sought the legal services of one Oliver H. Smith, an attorney who years later would represent Trail in another matter and would remember him as one who was considered in the neighborhood a quiet, inoffensive, and industrious man, unless you got him riled up, of course. This day, Trail's reputation would elicit an extraordinary outpouring of support from the community. During his time in jail, a steady stream of visitors came by to offer words of encouragement. The night before the trial, they went even farther. Fearful the sheriff would conspire with Cleveland to abscond with the prisoner, Trail supporters surrounded the jail, and with a bonfire blazing to stave off the cold, they vowed to ensure justice for their neighbor. The vigil lasted all night, prompting the would-be kidnappers to give up their quest. When the trial convened the next day, Trail was released, since no one appeared to bring charges against him. Now, any ordinary man might have thanked his lucky stars to be out of jail and would have resumed his life. But William Trail was no ordinary man. As one of his sons declared, his father was quick to take offense. Justifiably enraged over this assault on his freedom, Trail sought retribution by placing an ad in the Richmond, Indiana newspaper, The Intelligencer, which read, and I love this, "Reward. I will give $20 reward for the apprehension and delivery of John Cleveland and Samuel P. Hedges in Connersville Jail, Fayette County, Indiana, who attempted under false colors and pretenses on the 5th instant to kidnap or take me out of this state under a false pretend claim of James Blakely of Lawrence District, South Carolina." He meant Lauren District. "To whom I once, by the laws of Carolina, owed service, but have obtained my freedom. The above named Cleveland and Hedges, after having obtained their warrant under the provisions of the statute, finding their claim to be unsupported and fearing their villainy would be discovered and detected, deserted their cause and left this place about 11 o'clock on the night of the 7th instant, and it signed William Trail, a man of color, Connersville, 9th January, 1822. While Trail was fighting to secure his freedom, Indiana gained statehood. The new Constitution, as I indicated, was written in 1816, declared that, quote, "all men are born equally free and independent, and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, among which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, and of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Echoing the Northwest Ordinance, it prohibited the introduction of slavery or indentured servitude into the state, except for punishment for crime. And it stipulated that a system of free public education from grade schools to a state university would be established and equally open to all. Fine words, if they really meant it and pursued it. Yet it became perfectly clear that Black men and women were not intended to be included as equals in the newly formed state. First, the Constitution apportioned representation, quote, according to the number of white male inhabitants above 21 years of age in each county. It also provided for a militia that would be composed of, quote, all free, able-bodied male persons, but excluded Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians. And you know, this is happening because they don't want Black men or mulattoes or Indians to be armed. It denied Black men the right to vote by declaring that the elective franchise would be open to every white male citizen of the United States of the age of 21 years and upwards. In the decades that followed the adoption of the Constitution, the state enacted laws that reflected growing anti-Black sentiment. So the point is, they were anti-slavery, but they were anti-Black at the same time. African-American residents were not permitted to serve on juries, hold public office, or testify in court cases involving whites. The increasing number of immigrants from Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky led to passage of a law by 1831 that required Black men and women to register at the office of the county clerk, where they recorded their names, addresses, age, occupation, and description. And as dehumanizing as that is, as a historian, I thank them, because I can now look at these documents and come to all sorts of conclusions. So at least there was that ray of sunshine from it. The law stipulated that they also post a $500 bond to guarantee their good behavior, which was equivalent to over $16,000 in buying power today. Apparently, the measure only applied to new arrivals. At least there is no evidence that the Trails, which by this time would have included his wife, Sarah, and 3 of their 7 sons, there's no evidence that they registered with the clerk or posted a bond. In any case, the laws were not always enforced. Like most laws, they were on the record, waiting to be used to keep Black ambitions in check. Even when well known to the community, free African Americans faced the possibility of being accused of being a fugitive. Such accusations became more common with passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, as John Freeman would discover just a few years later. Freeman had arrived in Indianapolis in the 1840s and had become a respected member of the African American community. In 1853, one Pleasant Ellington claimed Freeman as his enslaved laborer who had run away. He claimed he was a man named Sam. Freeman spent more than 2 months in jail while his 3 attorneys gathered information from Georgia to confirm his identity. Although he was eventually released, the cost of proving his legal status depleted his resources. And this is a man who was quite wealthy as Black farmers and businessmen went during this period. I think he was worth $6,000. That's a lot of money for, that's credited to a Black man during this period. Like William Trail years before, he sued those who had been responsible for his detention, but he never recovered any money. Although he won the case, there was never a recovery. By 1850, Indiana had already experienced a long history of negatively distinguishing African Americans from the rest of its residents. That anti-Black sentiment continued in the decade before the Civil War. Eager to keep the state a haven for white men and women, and this is something that Lincoln agreed to as well. When Lincoln has won the presidency the first time, and they're trying to tell him, you know, the South is seceding, what are you going to do about it? He is saying privately, we can cut deals, but the one thing we cannot do is to allow the expansion of slavery because we want the territories free for white men. So, eager to keep the state a haven for white men and women, the legislature wrote a new constitution that included a clause, the notorious Article 13, banning new Black arrivals. Any contracts made between new arrivals and residents of the state would be declared void, and the offending employer would be fined no less than $10 and no more than $500. They love that $500 figure. While African Americans seem to routinely ignore the clause, the measure was sometimes enforced with dire consequences, as Arthur Berkshire and Elizabeth Keith would learn in 1856. Berkshire had lived near the Ohio-Indiana border for years and had decided to marry a woman from Ohio. They were married on the Indiana side and set up housekeeping in the state. Shortly thereafter, Berkshire was charged with and convicted of harboring his wife in violation of the Constitution. He was fined $10, and oh, get this, his marriage was annulled. While Article 13 was intended to keep African Americans from settling in the state, Indiana embraced colonization to remove Blacks who were already in residence. In 1829, Hoosiers had formed a colonization society in which free Black residents were encouraged to relocate to Africa. In order to finance such ventures, the 1851 Constitution authorized the use of fines collected for violations of the Exclusion Clause as appropriation for funding colonization to Africa. Now, it is not unusual for Indiana to have formed this society. These societies were all over the country. I mean, this was the idea. You get rid of the quote-unquote Negro problem by removing them. It's what Lincoln had said to a group of Black men in August of 1862 when he invites them to the White House and he says, you know, Black people are the reason why we're having this war. You need to leave. He wasn't quite that sharp, I guess, but people took offense to the idea that Black people should pack up and leave because there were racial tensions in the country. Despite legislative appropriations, very few Black Hoosiers accepted the offer to transport away from the place of their birth. Africa was not their home. These are people who had been born in America. Some of them had been here for generations, so they were not about to leave. While they suffered indignities and discrimination in Indiana, most were not willing to give up the connection they had to the place. The next few years would see the nation convulsed by the slavery question, not its extinction, but whether it would be allowed to expand. With the commencement of war, Black men in Indiana, as throughout the North, prepared themselves to enter the fray. Their motivation differed from that of other Americans who were most concerned with preserving the Union. They saw the potential for slavery's death in this conflict between white men and realized that the institution must be destroyed if the rights of all Black men and women were to be secured. But initially, Congress and President resisted having Black men enter the fight, fearing that it would be tied to Black freedom. And of course, they were also fearful that Black men would not be courageous enough to stand on the battlefield toe-to-toe with white men. They were proven wrong. The effort to enlist Black men into the Army as members of regularly organized units did not begin in earnest until President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation authorized the use of African Americans to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts. Black men were already serving in the Navy, but they were not serving in the Army. By May 1863, Congress formed the United States Colored Troops to oversee the recruitment, organizing, and training of Black soldiers. For a variety of reasons, Indiana was one of the northern free states that resisted enrolling Black soldiers. But that did not deter African American men. Anxious to enter the fight, they made their wishes public in the form of an open letter to Governor Morton. The undersigned citizens of Indianapolis, they wrote on August 12, 1863, would respectfully represent that we deeply sympathize with the country in her present distress, and that no people condemn the rebellion that has spread so much gloom over this once happy country more than we do. And fully sensible to the duty that we owe to the government, we hereby tender our services as home guards for the city of Indianapolis and the state of Indiana, should our services be demanded. We would therefore ask, if admissible, that arms be placed in our hands to be carefully preserved and properly used, and also returned to the proper officer when demanded. Of course, these men wanted to enter the fight because they understood that if they had a hand in saving the Union, then who would be willing to stand and deny them the right to citizenship? Well, they would be surprised later on to find out how many people would deny it. The letter is signed by Indianapolis African Methodist Episcopal minister Willis R. Revels, who was the brother of Hiram Revels, one of 2 Black U.S. senators who served during Reconstruction. And 91 other Black men served that petition, signed that petition as well. Reverend Revels' offer was rejected by the governor, who stated privately his concerns that an organized unit of Black men might provoke Confederate sympathizers. With the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, recruiters fanned out over the free states, including Indiana, to enlist volunteers for the USCT. The recruiting campaign gained traction during the spring of '63, when one of the earliest and most famous regiments of the United States Colored Troops, the 54th Massachusetts, was organized in Boston. Because of Governor Morton's reluctance to form an Indiana regiment, some of the state's Black regiments joined the 54th. By the summer, Morton began to warm to the idea of recruiting Black troops. In less than full-throated support of the courage and competence of Black men, he argued that he was, quote, in favor of using anything to put down the rebellion, even dogs and tomcats, if they could be of any use. The use of such troops will, I think, do away with the necessity of drafting so many white men. Morton's change of heart stemmed from the decline in the recruitment of white men. Like the other Union states, Indiana was required to meet regular quotas for volunteers. The latest quota was for 300,000 recruits who would serve for a 3-year period. Morton understood that he must turn to Black men to meet that goal. It was a decision that won the approval of the Trail Sons. This was their chance to fight for both the country in which they placed their hopes for advancement and for the freedom of enslaved people. It was an opportunity to show that they were worthy of sharing in the rights accorded to other Americans. Ironically, Benjamin, the youngest of the Trail men, was the first among his brothers to answer Morton's call for Black volunteers. And Benjamin and his older brother, William, had actually, in 1861, had actually gone to Indianapolis and had tried to enter, to serve as a volunteer, and they were rejected. And at least one of them, I can't remember now if it was both, but at least one of them actually worked as a military laborer, not as a soldier, but as a military laborer, which was okay at that time. They were quite willing to accept Black men as laborers, but not as soldiers. He traveled to Indianapolis, where he enlisted in the 28th USCT on December 29, 1863. And it's interesting that he goes there. He had gotten married. He had a child who I think may have been about 7 months old, and he goes to war. That bothers me a little bit, but a lot of men did that, and I think they're doing it because they think that they cannot secure their own lives and the lives of their children's future without going to war. Shortly thereafter, he was promoted to the rank of sergeant major. Benjamin's education and life experiences distinguished him from many of the other soldiers, but when it came to pay, he suffered alongside the rest. The monthly salary for white enlisted soldiers was $13 per month, with an additional $3.50 as a clothing allowance. Whatever the rank, black soldiers received $10 per month, with money withheld for clothing. One of Benjamin's comrades in arms offered the position of black soldiers on the issue of equal pay when he wrote, "We ask for equal pay and bounty, not because we set a greater value upon money than we do upon human liberty, compared with which money is mere trash, but we contend for equal pay and bounty upon the principle that if we receive equal pay and bounty when we go into war, we hope to receive equal rights and privileges when we come out of the war." Like black men in many other regiments, members of the 28th declined to accept the $7.50 per month offered them, electing instead to receive no pay rather than accept unequal treatment. And this is a serious position they're putting themselves and their families in, because black families don't have any other way to survive except what's being brought in by these men who've gone off to war. And if they have no salary, their families are suffering at home. Benjamin understood that he and his fellow soldiers would not receive their due, and that protest was futile. Yet he chose to stand with the rest of the men. He would learn to do without money, at least for a while. And in one of his letters home, he talks about having 3 1-cent stamps and a couple of coins, but he doesn't have very much to live on. But he was getting, I guess, what he needed from the Army, which wasn't very much. In May of '64, the 28th received orders to deploy to the Eastern Theater. Benjamin's final letters to his family before he left indicated both excitement and foreboding. "I have my doubts whether I ever come home after I leave camp," he wrote, "because it sometimes looks a little bad here, and this is a heaven compared with our expected future." Nevertheless, he looked forward to leaving for the East. The proclamation had strengthened his faith in the government to live up to the Declaration of Independence. "I do want to get as near to Washington as I can, as it will be my glory to visit the capital of this great republic before I am covered with the sod. I can say that I have much more respect for the country now than I had before." I love their way with words. These folk really were wordsmiths. Several days later, Benjamin arrived in Annapolis, Maryland, and later spent all of 12 hours in the nation's capital, long enough to fulfill his dream. By June, he had arrived at White House Landing, 25 miles southeast of Richmond, where a Union supply depot had been established. From there, the 28th engaged in skirmishes on their way to join General Burnside in the siege of Petersburg. And I love this part because one of the skirmishes they were involved in was in my little tiny county in Virginia. And there is a little plaque there that talks about the 28th having been there. And we think there's a possibility that there's some burials of members of the 28th there as well, because there were people who died in that skirmish. On July 30th, the regiment was part of an ill-fated battle outside of the city, known famously as the Battle of the Crater. So they had crossed the James River and gone to Hopewell and then on to Petersburg, and were involved in that fiasco, the Crater fiasco, where the Union sustained heavy casualties. Benjamin was reported to be among those Union soldiers killed, And all of the official records, all the official Union records say he was killed at the Battle of the Crater. But Confederate records and a gravesite revealed that he died 4 months later in a prisoner of war camp in Danville, Virginia. Within 5 months, Lee would surrender his army to Grant and virtually bring an end to the war. 3 other Trail's sons, James, David, and William Jr., entered the Army just before or soon after their brother's death. James, who joined in August '64, died of scurvy while he waited to be mustered out of the Army in Corpus Christi, Texas. David was drafted in October, so he was not a volunteer. He was drafted in October and would return home from the war. By the end of the decade, he took his own life while combating an illness. William, who did not enlist until February of 1865, returned home and spent the rest of his life as a successful, respected farmer and local politician. The disabilities under which the Trails and other Black Hoosiers lived were rescinded in the months and sometimes years following the end of the war, either through state action or because of the Reconstruction amendments. So change did not occur overnight. And we were talking earlier today about whether or not Indiana would have actually granted these rights to African Americans if not for these Reconstruction amendments, where they were forced to do it. And given the track record, I'm not so sure that it would have happened. I doubt seriously if it would have. Importantly, the exclusion clause of the 1851 Constitution was rescinded almost immediately. It was rescinded in 1866. No longer would African Americans have to worry about re-enslavement or have their labor auctioned off as punishment for violation of the laws. They could enter the state without posting a bond or being subject to arrest and fines. Their children could be educated in public schools, even though in separate facilities. Because although that law had said, in 1816 had said, that schools would be open, public schools would be open to all, that is not what happened. Black children did not have access to most of those schools. A few of them did, but in most areas, they did not. And so what Black parents did, like William Trail Sr., was they paid people to come in and teach their children. And William had enough money to do that. He wasn't filthy rich, but he certainly was comfortable enough that he could educate his children. And actually, his sons were known as some of the best educated scholars in the area because they had received that early training at home, and they had also gone to local schools, usually schools that had been established with the assistance, in some instances, of the Quakers. And they went to, a couple of them at least, went to boarding schools in Randolph County as well, the Union Literary Institute. And colonization was no longer a serious consideration for solving the problem of Black and white coexistence. The Emancipation Proclamation was the gateway to overturning many of the disabilities Black men and women faced in the Free State for over half of the 19th century. While they were ostensibly free before the war, their fortunes were inextricably tied to the enslaved. The continuation of slavery in other parts of the nation subjected them to unrelenting discrimination. By transforming the legal status of enslaved people from property to human beings in the Confederate South, and by allowing Black men the opportunity to fight to secure that new status, it paved the way for universal abolition, and that's in the 13th Amendment, because we know the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. The 13th Amendment allegedly did. There were still people who remained enslaved after that. And for securing, it paved the way for universal abolition and for securing the rights that Black men and women had fought for through generations. The Trails paid a dear price in their quest for freedom and equal treatment. William Sr. had died before the war began, but the values he and Sarah had passed on to their sons inspired them to fight for the freedoms that were enjoyed by other Americans. It is ironic that they and other African Americans believed so firmly in democracy. They physically resisted men who attempted to enslave or re-enslave them. They fought for their freedom in the courts. And when the survival of the nation was in jeopardy, they went to war to secure the Union, not because they were especially patriotic, although some were, but because they knew they had a better chance for freedom and equality with Northern victory than they did if the Confederates won. I'm reminded of the response of a free black man who was trapped behind Confederate lines during the war. When asked if he had been loyal to the Union, he answered, "I was always a Union man. I could not be anything else." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Medford. That was truly an eye-opening presentation, I must say, as someone who was in 7th grade in an Indiana history class many, many years ago. It really underscores that truism. These are things we learned about our state and our people that they truly was not in the history book. It was not in the classroom instruction at that time. Hopefully it is today. We have some time for questions for Dr. Medford, so I think, are there some microphones roaming around the
Absolutely.
facility? Okay, thank you. So, Jesse, if you would maybe take charge of question and answers. Thank you again, Dr. Medford.
Doctor, and I did has a child that Harriet Tubman. She was a great slave, but do you know why she escaped from the slaves and stuff in 1860 by Harriet Tubman?
Why she escaped?
Yes.
Oh, because no one wanted to be enslaved. Okay.
No, I just wanted to know about it because Harriet Tubman. I mean, she was a child and she was a slave and everything. But
Right.
I'm just want to understand why along her people she trying to move on on the Underground Railroad and everything. For
Right.
Underground Harriet Tubman.
So when she left, she was married. When she left, she asked her husband to go with her. He refused. He was too afraid to go. And she came back later to get him and other members of her family, and I think he had already remarried. But she went south, and recovered 70 people, rescued 70 people out of slavery. But she also did some other extraordinary things, like leading a group of soldiers up the Combahee River in South Carolina, where she helped to liberate 700 black people from slavery. So she was quite a woman, much braver than a lot of the people who were surrounding her. She was an extraordinary person, and we should always remember her sacrifice, because it was a sacrifice for her to leave her family. But she understood that she could no longer live under slavery, and even if she lost her life trying to escape bondage, it was worth it. So she leaves a lesson for us that we should take to heart. Thank you so much for that question.
Hi. I really enjoyed the talk, but I just had a quick question. As far as the political things that were happening in Indiana, is that unique to Indiana because of the fact that it was a new territory, or was this a story that was seen throughout other states that also bordered the South, like Ohio and PA?
A lot of this is happening in Ohio and in Illinois as well. Some of Indiana's laws, though, tended to be a little over the top. The idea that you're going to charge a man with harboring his wife, and then you're going to annul his marriage. That's just mean. So, but yeah, the other border states, we know that, the other Midwestern states are doing some of the same kinds of things, because the idea is we don't want slavery here, but we don't want black people here either, okay? They don't want to compete with the labor of enslaved people, but they don't want to compete with blacks in general. They talk about the fact that this is a white man's state. We don't want black people around. But that's what some people are saying. What you see with William Trail, though, is that some people, a few people, are able to get around that because of how valuable they're seen in the community, or just by sheer orneriness, I don't know what. But some of the things I didn't tell you about was William Trail was accused of burning a minister's barn. Okay, before he left, he came to Henry County because he was having some problems in the county he was living at the time. It was either Fayette, I think it was Fayette, or Wayne, I think it was Fayette County, yeah. So the barn burned, the animals were trapped in and so forth. Other neighbors came to the rescue to try to, extinguish the fire. Apparently, Trail just stood by watching. And so the minister, and I should say, Trail helped build the church, but was denied membership in the church because he was black. And so the barn's being burned. The minister says he thinks Trail did it. Trail takes him to court. He sues him for slander. And he wins. He wins. And you don't expect that that's going to happen in Indiana or any place else, for that matter. But he wins. And I think it has something to do about the grudging respect that people have for him. I don't know that any other man could have gotten away with that, but he left town pretty soon afterwards. He left the county because he recognized that he was not going to be able to survive. His family would not live comfortably in that county with all that was going on. And people were jealous of him too. He was purchasing land. People were trying not to sell land to him. So he goes to Henry County where he can get land from the public land office. So there's a lot of confrontation there, but the guy sticks it out. He decides nobody is going to abuse him because he's already lived through hell. And so he pushes forward. He teaches his sons to push for freedom as well. Two of them lose their lives, but at least slavery is ending as a consequence of what those men and the other men, black and white, did during the war.
Good evening, Doctor. I just enjoyed your talk and was just wondering, as with the recent uproar over the inaccurate claims that critical race theory is being taught in public schools, the argument seems to be one, that I understand it, the argument is, one, racism has never been and is not now systemic in American society, or if it was, it's wrong to teach it because it may make the students uncomfortable and it puts the United States in a bad light. As an educator and a historian, and particularly given the light of everything you've said tonight, how do you respond to that?
Well, I don't understand the uproar about critical race theory. It's not being taught in the schools. There are a few places where it's being taught in universities. I'm not sure that I understand the real definition. I mean, what I see, if I'm looking, and as I've always looked at American history, I've looked at it from the perspective of a black woman, a woman from the South, a woman who grew up in poverty, a woman who has had opportunities. But all of that comes in. Historians bring all kinds of baggage to the study of history. We can lie, deny, and say we're objective. We're not. Nobody's objective when they're studying history. They're bringing this stuff to. Now, I try to look at all sides, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to come up with something like, well, it's America and we're perfect, because we're not. And so if we talk about, American exceptionalism, to me, America could be truly exceptional if America dealt with its past, honestly. And given the state of affairs at the moment, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. We will destroy ourselves before we get to the point that we are honest about what we have done and what we are still doing. So, and it's so sad to me. I did a program last year, I think it was, as sort of a kickoff to the celebration of the Constitution. And afterwards, there was a person who was a current senator at that time who took offense, I think, to a comment I made about book banning and how dangerous it was. And I was talking about Harriet Tubman and how, how do we look at someone like Harriet Tubman? Is that going to be offensive to some Americans? Well, yes, it is going to be offensive to some Americans. And so he said, well, when was a book on Harriet Tubman banned? And I said, maybe not yet, but we're getting there, We're already seeing books about King and other people who taught nonviolence, and people are saying, no, you shouldn't tell students those stories because they're going to be upset. No one worried about me being upset when what I heard as I was growing up was that Black people were slaves and they contributed nothing to society. And just last year, I received an email from someone who had seen a C-SPAN program that I had done, who said, Black people haven't contributed anything. There have been no Black scientists, no Black this, no Black that. And I thought, my God, he has made the point of why we need to teach inclusive history. So it's really sad. I don't think that we understand that truth will set us all free. Truth will help us understand where we are at the moment and how we make ourselves and our nation better. And I think most of us want to make it better. Well, no. Some of us want to make it better, okay? But it's really disheartening that students are sort of at the center of all of this. Everybody's saying, well, no, they're so fragile, that you can't tell them anything bad about the United States. So they go off thinking that they and their society, that they're perfect. And that's not good for anybody. Sorry, that I got on my little soapbox there for a moment. So,
I had a question. My question was, I know a lot of Africans come over here from Africa. They were brought over here from Africa on the slave trip. But I'm also aware that there were Black people already here in the United States. Where did they come from? I mean, did they come over as slaves too, or were they already here?
Sure. So one of the things that I have a problem with the 1619 Project, and I know that I'm going to upset some people by saying that, but the implication was that everything started with the English, that nobody was here, before the English arrived. I mean, in terms of Black people, that the English brought the first Black people here. That's not true. There were other nations that had come here before the English did. The Spanish are here soon after Columbus comes, They're bringing, you have significant numbers of enslaved people coming in to the Americas by, 1520. And the English are coming, bringing Black people at least, in 1619, maybe earlier. Maybe earlier. We just know that John Rolfe has this little statement that says, 20 Negroes are brought in and they are traded, for food. But we don't know how many were here before that. But certainly there were other Black people brought in by other nations before Africans were brought in. Some of them were enslaved. Some of them probably were not. We also assume that everybody who comes who's from the African continent was enslaved. Most of them, the vast majority were, but there were a few that are coming in, especially places, the places like New York. When the Dutch have control of New York and called it New Netherland, there are other people coming in then. The argument is whether or not they were enslaved or whether or not they had half freedom. And that's still a debate that historians are making today.
Any further questions?
We do have a question from a viewer at home, and they're wondering about Quakers in Indiana who protected enslaved persons. Were Quakers arrested or forced out of state? Was their personal property seized? And they're wondering about locating records related to this.
Okay, I think what I heard you say was, are Quakers facing repercussions because of the work that they're doing? Is that to protect African Americans? Was that the gist of the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So anyone who is running afoul of the law can be punished, including Quakers. And Quakers are playing a very prominent role, you know, in the Underground Railroad. So, but not just Quakers. Black people are as well. We sometimes forget that black people are very central to the Underground Railroad, especially in Indiana, with these free black communities that are established in southeastern Indiana. But the Quakers definitely are being punished if they are caught, like anyone else. So the laws are there to deter any kind of assistance. And so any violator can be punished. But as I indicated before, some people find ways around the law. They aren't always punished. But if the laws are there, just in case someone wants to use them. So I've always felt that the laws only tell us what people are fearful of. Doesn't tell us how much people are punished. Just that somebody's saying, okay, we got to have this law here because if they start getting out of hand, we have to have a way to control them. And people lose their lives as well. I mean, you know, with the anti-abolitionism, especially in this state, you know, abolitionists are attacked. Frederick Douglass was here in Pendleton, and I think it's 1842 or 1843, and he sustains an injury that stays with him until the end of his life. You know, so there was a lot of violence in this state as well. You know, so the laws say one thing. The laws may say anti-slavery, but the laws also say anti-black.
Another viewer is wondering if you've found any living descendants of Mr. Trail.
Yeah, we're still looking. There is a man in Texas, I think, or he was in Texas a little while ago, who was involved in the educational system. And he may still be alive. And some of Trail's relatives, there was one woman named Clotilde, I think. She wrote a letter, I think, in 1993 or 1994. She had she'd gotten a master's from Columbia University, and she was teaching in the school system in DC, I believe, but she's long gone. So yeah, we're hoping to find someone. But if we do, it'll be a very, very, very distant relative. So it's a shame we don't have DNA to see if we can find someone.
Any other questions?
With all of your vast study on Lincoln, if you had the opportunity to ask him any question, what might that be?
Oh, that's a good one. I think I would ask him how he made the transition, because Lincoln was someone who felt comfortable telling racist jokes, what we would consider today as racist jokes. He did not have a favorable impression of the average black person, but he had black acquaintances that probably were more than just acquaintances. You know, someone like William Flurville, for instance, his barber. There was a close association there that I don't think we can deny. There was a kind of respect there, I think, that he didn't necessarily have for everybody. He had a respect for Frederick Douglass, but his treatment of Sojourner Truth bothers me. He called her auntie. He treated her like she was beneath him, I think. And that might have nothing to do with race. It might have to do with a gender thing, you know? So I would ask him about that. You know, how do you go from being a man of the South, because he was a man of the South. He may have lived in Indiana, he may have gone on to Illinois, he was born in Kentucky. Those Southern roots were there, and he had certain kinds of sensibilities. So I'm always amazed at how he makes that transition, how despite the fact that he shares certain sensibilities with other Americans that are not very nice sensibilities, he can still put that aside and do the right thing to save the nation. And it goes beyond that, because I know he's doing it to save the nation, but he also recognizes that this is the right thing to do. And so I would like to get at that. You know, what is your thought process? How did you come to that conclusion? And what took you so long? You know? Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming out this evening. Safe travels home. We're grateful to have you here tonight.
Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne. Learn more under the Explore tab at acpl.info.